Welcome to my Wellness Spring podcast, where we uncover transformative journeys that inspire and uplift. In this episode, meet Martin Royds, an inspirational fifth-generation beef cattle farmer. Martin's story is one of resilience and innovation. After facing personal health challenges from chemical use on his farm, he shifted to natural sequence farming and regenerative practices. Through initiatives like Tombara, he's championing changing attitudes towards sustainable agriculture, doubling productivity, and even achieving water resilience during droughts. Get ready to be inspired as we explore Martin's journey, his passion for combating climate change, and his commitment to building a better future for agriculture and our planet. Welcome to Wellness Spring, Martin. It's so lovely to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Beverly, and Brian behind the camera.
And where I'd like to ask you, being a fifth generation farmer, what was the turning point for you to change from conventional farming to regenerative farming?
Beverly, I think I started early, even when I was a young kid growing up not far from here on the Shoalhaven River. I had a veggie garden there and I loved that, and so I was always interested in growing plants. When I was at boarding school, I set up a veggie garden there, and then as a result of the cattle crash, we got pulled out of boarding school, and so I was only 14, 15 then, and realised that agriculture was struggling financially, and we'd sort of my father had gone through the boom years of the 1950s when the Korean wool boom was on, and then it had been a steady decline. So you could see that financially, in terms of trade, we're going backwards. Ecologically, at school we learned about salt expanding at a tennis court a second in Western Australia, and all these things were thrown at us when we were at school, and the Dust Bowl and those sort of things were still fairly big topics when I was at school. And so you've got this financial, economic things, and I deliberately went to university to learn natural farming, or natural science. So I did an applied science, natural resources degree, instead of going to agricultural college where most people learned how to bigger machinery, more chemicals and that sort of stuff. And I thought it was just more of the same, what I would have learnt there. And so I left uni, sort of a greenie, wanting to do all that, but then I got hoodwinked into believing that the new chemicals out were just the best way, because instead of destroying structure of soil with ploughs, which I'd learned about at university was not a good idea, these new chemicals only killed what you asked them to kill, and they became inert as soon as they hit the soil, and all those sort of lovely things that the salesmen tell you. So I got heavily into chemical farming and direct drilling and those sort of things in this district, and was one of the first spraying units and direct drillers, and I poisoned myself within 18 months and blew up, and now I just can't go near chemicals. So it was sort of, I don't know how I got conned into going that way when I'd learnt all this natural stuff, but then it was virtually forced on me to change. I'd been exposed to Hamish Mackay biodynamics and that sort of stuff, and thought he was on some pretty good whoopee weed, and it sounded all pretty ooh-hoo sort of things. But now I realise that there's a lot going on, and so I just then went out to educate myself. Got hold of, it probably started with a mate of mine ringing up who I used to spray and sow his pasture, Rob, over the hill here, and he was doing the figures on farming at that time, which was in the early 90s. And he said, okay, we were in set stocking regime, and we used to plough everything out, put in a cover crop, and then not a cover crop then, it was just an oat crop for winter, and then you'd sow your pasture. And then when that pasture finished, you went and did it all again. And he did the maths. And he said, okay, Marty, how much does it cost to sow and spray a pasture? Because I started doing it chemically for him. And back then it was $240 a hectare. And he said, how long does it last? I said, 5-7 years. And then we all did it again. And then he said, how long does it take to get your money back? And I went, I don't know. He said, well, I've just done the figures and it's 10 to 12 years. So if it only lasts 5 to 7 years and it takes 10 to 12 years to get your money back, here, I won't use the expletive he used, but he said, we're stuffed. And he was running a big operation here, 10,000 acres, between Braidwood and Canberra, and he said, I can't see a way out of this. And that week, Alan Savoury's partner, Stan Parson, was talking in Goulburn on holistic management. And so I said, Rob, let's go and listen to this guy. And we came out there, Rob punched the air and went, wow, here's the solution. Yeah. And he went fully into holistic management, went and did the course, which was $2,000 for the course back then, which was pretty expensive. I didn't think I could afford that, so I didn't do it. And I just hung around Rob and picked it up. But I'd actually started using a big mob of sheep already to control weeds, because in 1990 that bull market crashed and I'd just bought a lot of sheep. And I didn't want to lose the money that I'd put into them, so I held them and used them as a weed control.
Well, that's great.
So I was on that track.
Yeah, so traditionally your father was a conventional farmer, so would he have used chemicals? Or?
He started off, he actually wanted to be a scientist also, and he grew up towards the end of the Second World War. He joined the army but was too young to go off, and he was in a local support network. But he was an innovator. He did bring superphosphate, or was one of the early guys to use superphosphate in the area, inoculated clover, myxomatosis and those sort of things he brought in, and he actually got very sick. Not related to myxomatosis, but locals all said, yeah, told you shouldn't go mucking around with those bugs, and he got pneumonia, but that was because he was just a bit of a workaholic. So yes, he'd been doing that. He did work very hard. He started with a farm that ran 500 wethers, and by the time he went upstairs, he had 15,000 DSE equivalent country. So he'd been hard worker, successful, innovative. He didn't get into chemicals, but when I did, he was employing me to pasture improve his country. And I did a few paddocks for him. And yeah, then I went on my organic path and holistic management, and then I met Peter Andrews, and I went out and met Christine Jones, later Elaine Ingham, and Alan Savoury, and I sucked all the information I could out of them. And then when Peter came along, I actually started the Natural Sequence Association under Peter's tutelage. And so yeah, it was pretty heavy into all that, and started doing talks in town about a new way of farming. And Dad came along one time to one of those talks, And at the end of it, he came up to me and said, "So you're telling me everything I've done's wrong?"
Wow.
And it hit me hard. I went, "Oh, geez." And he was pretty serious. And I looked at him and I said, "Oh, come on, Dad, you changed, you were innovative and did all these things. And I started ploughing and sowing like you did, and realised that it blew away, washed away, and was not economically viable, and we had to change. And here's, the next bit of knowledge." And he took that on board and then used to come to my field days and drag my brother along. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've covered a lot there. So it's great that you worked with all the top pioneers. And I think for the listeners, especially for people who are new to farming and especially regenerative farming, you hit the nail on the head with the cost. You had that aha moment when, Rob said to you with the figures,
Yep.
And so that's a big bonus for people to not choose the chemicals. Obviously, you got very sick. And how did that present?
I literally got poisoned one day. I was out I bought some country about 80 k's from here, and I was out there spraying, and I got home and I'd blown up like the Michelin Man. I just was all puffed up. I remember walking up the courtyard at home, and this woofer there came out and she said, "Oh, can I help you?" And I went, "It's Martin." And she couldn't recognise me.
Wow.
And she went, "Oh my God, what have you done?" And I went, "I think I've poisoned myself." But I'd literally been told by the chemical reps that glyphosate, when it hits the soil, became inert. So I used to, if I got it spilt on me, I'd pick up some dirt and rub that into my hands, and that neutralised it. Not. And, yeah. So yeah, and now I can't even go near a chemical truck. I can smell it. I went to my friend's place the other day, and I went past his RTV, and I start getting a rash. And
wow,
yeah.
It's amazing. Well, I'm glad you're still alive to tell the tale.
So am I.
And so how long did that process take? And did you face any challenges legally or otherwise while you're changing over?
For me, it was a sort of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back process, because it was so new then, the whole concept. All of them, Alan Savoury, Peter, Christine Jones had been thrown out of her university, Elaine Ingham was thrown out of her university. So you've got all these people that the authorities didn't want to accept what they were saying. And so, you've got your cautious hat on, and I was borrowing money to buy these farms, so I was heavily in debt. And you couldn't just flip because, you had to pay the mortgage and things like that. Or I thought I couldn't. So for me, it probably took 10, 15 years. Peter would say I'm still slowly turning over, because he claims that a lot of the education I got at university was siloed, and it's a hard process to get out of that into the holistic thinking. What I have seen, for your listeners, is people who've come along, like my elder sister, who went off for 20 years as an artist and then came back as my father was passing away and took over the family farms. She flipped those farms in 3 years by just saying, right, what do I need to do? Who do I need to talk to? She went and did a holistic management course. She hung around Peter. She did some, I think she did some Elaine Ingham courses on soil biology and that. and absolutely flipped the farms from they were covered in weeds, they were not making money, to the weeds disappeared, and she started making a profit again.
So if you could turn back the clocks, what would you do differently, if anything?
Oh, I'd do it a lot quicker and earlier, yes. So it's a classic story. You know, you always wished you planted a tree 30 years ago, but you've still got to plant it today if you want to enjoy it in another 30 years. So, I wish I planted more trees. Ideally, I mean, now when I buy new country, I go in and the first process is to put the contours in, slow the water down, stop the erosion, those sort of things, and then look at building biodiversity. And it's amazing how you can flip country. You know, when we've taken 200 years to stuff it up, if you can turn it back again in 3 years, it's really extremely quick.
That's brilliant news, you know, for anybody starting out or anybody thinking of changing over. But obviously I'm sure the concerns would be, how can they make money for the existing farmers while they're changing over? Yeah.
I used to spend $10,000 a year fertilising. To put my natural sequence farming process in cost $12,000, so nearly 1 year's fertiliser budget, and that flipped the place from being a drain of fertility and water to holding the water and rehydrating the land. So in one process, and we built those for, we put in 12 years down at the big erosion gully, which runs from virtually one end of Chillamatong to the other, 2 kilometres. That transformed the farm from, as I said, a drain to a hydrated land, and then you go into a dry period and you've got feed when people haven't. You can get your money back pretty damn quickly. I haven't put any fertiliser on now for over 20 years, and so I've saved $200,000 in fertiliser fees.
How long did it take you to make those weirs and contours?
The first lot, the biggest change is changing your understanding of how the landscape works. So that probably took 10 years to change the brain. And then, I met Peter in 2005, and we did the structures in 2007, early 7. So it was a bit over a year after I met Peter that we went just boom. And that literally only took, I think it was 5 weeks to go from one end of the farm to the other and put all the weirs in.
Yeah.
Then the next 18 years I've put a lot of contours in, and I'm always playing in the mud and putting more in. But those initial ones were what changed it. And then the exciting thing is, Beverly, that you go out each morning now. When I was a chemical farmer, you went out every morning and thought, what have I got to kill? What's attacking me? There's a fire or a flood or a famine or the financials. There was always something that you're fighting as a farmer. And you mentioned earlier the farmers, too many farmers who are committing suicide, and that to me is because they're fighting this battle every day, and a lot of the time they're fighting a losing battle. And a bit like my mate Rob, he was depressed when he did the figures and realised that there was no financial way out of where their farm was heading. And also I think most farmers, or 99% of farmers, want to leave their land in a better state. And if they're honest with themselves, the farming techniques we've been forced into in the last few decades, and probably even for centuries, has been mining the land. And so your gut's telling you it's not sustainable. And then once you see you've flipped your mind into going out each day looking for something that's positive and something that you just need to tweak it and it gets better and better, then it's a totally different physical thing for you, mentally and physically.
Yeah, that's wonderful news. And you've mentioned Peter a few times. So Peter Andrews, you said you learnt the natural sequence farming from. And I know when we visited you before, we've seen the beautiful chain of ponds, and you said you named one of them Peter's Ponds.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain about Peter's work and how the water, you did hint on it, how put in the contours that they hold the water, so if there is a fire or drought, the water can resurface and bring up the nutrients. Like how important are those benefits, and are there any other benefits?
Oh, they're extremely important, and it's you are literally flipping it from a negative feedback loop. So this farm had a series of boggy meadows that went down the 2 kilometres of the farm, and what I've learnt from Peter is his observation of how the Australian landscape functioned. And so he quite blatantly says that if Australia had not developed this process, it would have eroded into the sea. We're one of the oldest continents on the planet, and the erosion's happening all the time, and without a process of slowing that water down, holding fertility, we would have ended up in the bottom of the ocean. So the process is that plants slow down the water and create on a contour a meadow that then holds more and more material behind it, and so you end up with these boggy meadows perched. I've seen them perched very high up in mountains, and because the material gets held on that contour, and we see it if you've mown your lawn and then you get a big rain event, you see those little contours of grass that get caught on the slope of your lawn. It's the same process, but in Australia it's often on the Murray-Darling scale, where it could be hundreds of kilometres across some of these weirs. And the early explorers saw these, where they rode in to try and find the inland lakes and seas of Australia, and they found these marshlands that went for 100 miles, and they stood on their horse back and couldn't see over the reeds. So that process of the water plants holding the fertility back created the boggy meadows. And so if you imagine Gillimatong had at least 4 or 5 of these going down, where black soil slowly built up in those boggy meadows and was held there in a dry time. Again, early explorers went into areas where they said it hadn't rained for 6 months. I don't know how they found that out, but that's what they wrote. And they said the grass was still green. So these boggy meadows have got, on here they might be only 4 or 5 metres deep, but they're 5 metres deep, 50% water. And so the grasses growing there have got a huge sponge of water to keep sucking out of in a dry time. When the early explorers came here, or the people came and took over this land, and my ancestors were very early here in Braidwood, they came in 1840, those boggy meadows were hard to plough and sow for wheat, which they grew here, because they were just too wet and boggy. So they put a drain in them, and those drains took off. And when I came here, they were up to 4 metres deep. So you've then got this boggy meadow that was full of water and fertility. It's got a 4 metre deep drain in it that sucks the water out of the boggy meadow, and if it rains, it runs into that drain and out, and so you're leaching your fertility off the surface and in that soil profile. And I really didn't understand that till I met Peter and went into it in depth, that those boggy meadows, which I've got here, were my least productive paddocks on the farm, even though they were this beautiful black soil, but they'd been leached so much they'd turned into a hard dead rock, and nothing grew there. Cocky's bootlace, which is a grass that looks like the old leather Cocky's bootlace, so not very palatable, and poa tussock, was really dead stuff. And yes, that's what was happening. Those are drained and taken fertility away. When we came in, Peter showed me how to block them back up again. Initially he was saying put rocks in there and create a leaky weir. But when we discovered that I had an erosion gully that was not named and not a third order stream, I was legally able to go in there and put structures in there. As I said, for $12,000 to send a D8 down the erosion gully, and we filled the entire erosion gully in with a series of weirs, and that just flipped it from a drain to a hydrating process.
Wow. And I know you mentioned when we were here the last time you had a field full of tussocks. Is that the field you're talking about? Because you said it was slowly disappearing.
Yeah. Well, that at the head of the farm, that was so rough with tussocks you couldn't ride a motorbike across the paddock. They were sitting on big black mounds because it was boggy, the cattle had pushed these tussocks up, and they were sitting half a metre off the ground. And then there were other paddocks lower down that were pure poa tussock. And my grandparents told me when I came in, they said, listen, we've ploughed that, we've tried everything, and they keep coming back. Don't just ignore those paddocks and focus on the hills. But I've turned those around. That's initially I used the big mob of sheep to graze them down, and then rested and chewed it down. And I thought I was doing a great job until then I realised I was actually flogging it harder because I left them in there too long, and it compacted it all. But that's things you learn as you go along.
Yeah.
We turned it from tussock to now it's a good pasture.
Pretty.
That's good.
We were taught as a chemical farmer, you don't want to let any of these weeds go to seed, so you spray them all and just stop that weed cycle. And that's why they're burning all the country out in western New South Wales at the moment. They want to try and kill the weeds. And you're going, if you've killed the weeds, that means you've killed all the biology in your soil, and what are all the little bugs going to eat? And there's a negative feedback loop happening there. And the reality is, you should never be able to kill all the weed seeds in your process. But and I think I had a minister, sort of advisor from Agriculture New South Wales, and we were having these discussions for about 5 years, and she still didn't get what I was on about until she came out here one time, and I said, I've just rotary hoed a patch up through that pasture there, and look what's come up. So there was this beautiful pasture, and then there were all these weeds, thistles and carrot weeds and sorrel and everything you could think of coming up. And I'm going, what do you think of that? She said, oh God, you better spray all those weeds or they could take over. And I went, they just came up because I cleared all the pasture. The seeds are there and there, but they're not coming up. I don't need to poison them. I just need to get a healthy pasture growing, and they won't express themselves. But they're there. If something goes wrong, it gets burnt, I overgraze it, or I plough it, the seeds are there to cover the ground and repair it all. And I need those weeds. And you just saw the light go into going, oh my God, and she was looking around the whole paddock going, there's no weeds here. Yeah, but the seeds were there. Those are not a second cycle of weeds. They just are just coming up. And it's exciting to see that aha moment. And
a light bulb.
Yeah,
That's great. And like you say, you got allergic to it with all the chemicals. If the animals are eating those chemicals, what is it doing to us long term?
It's bizarre. I even did it myself. wanted to reduce the amount of chemicals I was using, and I found that one of the chemicals that we used to kill flatweeds with thistles and those sort of things was MCPA amine. And if you sprayed it on at a fifth of the normal rate, it changed the chemical structure of the thistle, and it went from a flatweed to standing up, and it went from high carbohydrates to high sugars, and I could get my fat lambs to eat them. So I could use 1/5 the amount of chemical and still get rid of the weeds by using the sheep to eat them. And then I sold them as fat lambs without even thinking, that chemical's now in those fat lambs. Because we were told that, it just became inert and disappeared, and maybe we didn't want to think about that chain. But I've seen in the last 20 odd years huge increases in allergies, mental health issues in young kids, and I think 90% of it is down to the food we're eating. Roundup was developed as a fungicide, and somebody told me the other day, it wasn't just a fungicide, it was nearly a biocide. And our gut's full of all these little bugs that break down food to give us the nutrients we need, and we've got Roundup now in our system. It's killing all those bugs and stopping nutrient pathways. We also went from the complexity of compost and organic fertilisers to these NPK chemical farming systems, where from the 97 elements we were only using 3 in a very chemical salt form. It was just crazy, the experiments we really went through. And the guinea pigs have been our kids.
Yeah.
And they're actually, the canaries are saying it's not good. And we need to change. And I get people coming and say, I can't afford organic food. And I say, I can't afford not to, because I can't afford to get sick. I don't want to, have the medical bills. And if I eat that crap food, I will get sick. And
yeah, that's really good advice for the listeners when they choose to buy food. It's not about the short-term cost, it's about your long-term health, and obviously the amount of money you pay on medications and surgeries and so forth.
Far exceeds the cost of buying some healthy food.
Yeah.
Most people don't. I had the Department of Agriculture, the federal department came here last week, and we were going through nutrient density of food, and I was explaining how carrots used to have 20,000 parts per million of carotene in them, but you can go and get one of those chemical carrots from Woolworths, and it could have 70 parts. So that's 70 instead of 20,000.
Wow.
Now, if you've got that 70 parts at $1 and you've got 20,000 parts at $3, which is the best value? This is far cheaper than buying that. And not only that, that's all in salts. And I've had somebody here left some Woolworths carrots here, and I went away for a couple of weeks and came back, and I had my organic ones in there, and I got them out, and you could bend them into a bracelet, and and I started eating it, and I went, it still tastes pretty good. And I was looking at these Woolworths ones, and I pulled it out, and it was bright orange, firm as anything, and I snapped it, and you could still see the crystals of it's basically the chemical fertilisers are high in salts, and so they suck in water to try and osmotically balance things, and you end up with these cells that are really busting, full of water and salt, and no nutrients, and they snap.
Wow.
But I smelt it, and I could smell the chemicals, and I didn't even want to put these carrots in my compost heap. I actually drove down the road throwing them out the window. But you're thinking, oh my God, these things are poison. Yeah. And they look like that. Likewise, if you get a lettuce and you find in the stem there's a hollow bit, plants shouldn't have hollow bits in the middle. It's because these cells have taken on so much salt, they've got to take in water to balance it, and they've expanded out and left air pockets in there, and you see broccoli, lettuce, celery with these air pockets in there, and it's artificially fertilised, and they're not good for you, not good for the plant.
Yeah, exactly. That's terrifying just to think about it. Just to quickly go back to water, because I believe that farmers are only allowed a certain amount of water on their land. So how do you manage that? Because I know you've got quite a few.
Yeah. Just between you and me. Yes, the legal thing is we're allowed to harvest 10% of the rain that falls on the land. And there's all sorts of calculations to figure that out. And that's with surface dams. However, there are a few loopholes, and that is that you can build erosion control structures and they're not incorporated in that harvestable rights. And then last year, I think, in this area, they changed the rules from 10% to 30%.
Oh.
And which seemed a hell of a big jump, but and then the new state government's got in and they've changed it back again. So there's a bit of a flip-flopping around in the legals of that. I've been accused of holding up more water and stealing it from my lower down neighbours. The erosion gully that runs off Chilmatong used to be ephemeral. It'd flood and then it'd be dry. In winter it was boggy, in summer it was just a dry erosion gully. Now that I've blocked it all up, we've got a pipe at the bottom that's trickling water out, and in 2019, 2009, when the Shoalhaven River stopped flowing, and that supplies 10% of Sydney's water, the mighty Shoalhaven, literally stopped flowing totally, and my system was still flowing 20,000 litres a day. So when you understand the principles and go through the process of slowing the water down the landscape, you actually end up with more water coming off the farm. And when Peter first told me that, I went, you can't make water, but you actually can. And the two processes are dew, so the daily water cycle. When I've got my long green grass there, it harvests dew every day, at least probably 150 to 200 days a year we get dew. If you've got short grass with bare ground, you don't get any dew at all. So I'm getting 1 to 2 mils a day.
Wow. That
my neighbour's not getting. And then also you're protecting your soil with the grass we have there and the mulch we want to have on the soil. So if you get say a 5 mil rain event, mine's wet all the time with the dew, that 5 mils goes in and it's held in the soil. My neighbours get 5 mils, it evaporates in the next couple of days and they're back to zero again. So if you have a series of 5 mil rain events over 2 weeks, I've seen my neighbours get no growth at all and their soil's bone dry at the end of 20, 30 mils. Mine's going in and just building that bank of water, and then it starts flowing out the bottom because my bank's full. So that's one process.
Yeah.
The other is the evaporation that I mentioned by having ground cover, but the evaporation is far less off all my water bodies because I've got water plants, I've got screens to slow the wind down, I've got water plants that slow the surface area wind down, they increase the humidity, they decrease the temperature of the water. So if you've got a farm dam that's muddy, the top bit becomes really hot, and I've measured that bit 28 degrees on a very hot day, and below that it stratifies out and you get a deoxygenated cold bit underneath that's 15 degrees. On my weirs, where the water's clear, it was 18 degrees right through the whole soil profile. So 28 degrees, 18 degrees, you get 10 times more evaporation off that water than off my system. So I
Wow,
get less
that's-
evaporation, more infiltration. I
Yeah.
actually make more water and have more water coming off the farm than my neighbours.
Wow, and that's a really good incentive for any farmer to have the weirs and contours and so forth.
Because those laws were written in 1912 when we'd already destroyed most of the systems that were functioning in Australia, and we had an eroded drainage mentality, and they even had a dam mentality too. So their goal was to get as much water into their dam so then they could sell it to the irrigators or back to Sydney or whatever. It didn't take long when I've had some of those officer water guys here for them to realise that because they came here to issue a fine because I'd done my structures, and the person downstream was saying, Martin, stop my water. And I'd asked them, we just had a flood event, the Tallowa Dam, which catches 10% of Sydney's water on the Shoalhaven. I said, when did it first start overflowing in that rain event? And it was like day 3 of the rain event. And that's basically the first bit of water hit there and it filled up and overflowed. And then it flooded over there and they had a big flood and it all went out to sea with all our fertility and left a lot of gravel in the bottom of the dam. So they're losing capacity and we're losing our fertility. And I showed them here how my system hadn't even fully filled up yet. And it was at least day 8 till my system filled up and started overflowing, and it was clear water overflowing. And then that water went down, and they could then see that if they had the whole of the Shoalhaven catchment functioning as it used to, they wouldn't have had that flood. They wouldn't have lost fertility. They wouldn't have filled their dam with silt. They would have had the water slowly coming up and then flowing for another 3 years afterwards. And so they didn't issue me with a fine. They went down. Well, actually, I had a head of flood mitigation for the World Bank go and try and talk to this neighbour, and he came back and he said, you're never going to convince him. He's set on his ways, you're stealing his water. But unfortunately that guy passed away, and the new people in the next drought we had, they were in the pub and everybody's going, oh, our dams are all dry, the Shoalhaven's dry, the Mongala River stopped flowing, and they went, oh, our creek's still flowing. I went, oh, who's upstream of you? And they said, oh, Martin. There must be something happening up there. But yeah, their creek kept flowing right through the drought. So now they realise that I'm not stealing their water, I'm actually
giving them water.
Yeah. And it does sound counterintuitive. You think if you've got all these structures there that you're going to be taking water. If they're well designed, then you should end up with more water. More big dams is not a good idea because they are evaporation dishes.
And climate change is a buzz at the moment, and you hinted on, when the lands are tilled and dirt, the heat rises, and your neighbouring farmer, he's not able to retain the water. So there's billions of farms around the world, and if they're all tilling the land, then of course this is going to affect climate change.
Yeah, and we've been doing it for at least 5,000 years. The Romans 2,000 years ago turned all the top of Africa, their wheat bowl of Tunisia and all that northern parts of Africa into the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
It was really productive country 2,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago, the Nile was really productive, way out into what's now desert. And man has done a lot of damage. We want to get as much off the land and pay as little for it as we can, and that has resulted through those practices in farmers being the peasant that was just relied on to feed the city.
Yeah.
And we exhausted the land. The Chinese have it in their mythology from thousands of years ago that if you clear the land you will exhaust the fertile bits down the bottom, and there needs to be a balance between the plants, the animals and everything.
Yeah. So in summary, if there's someone new to farming, what would be your top 3 tips to them?
Probably not talk to an old farmer like me who's still stuck in the old ways. No, I'd say the best is to open your mind to how to read the landscape and to set up positive feedback loops and set your goals. Mine's to not only have an environmentally functioning landscape with biodiversity in the plants, the soil, and that, but also biodiversity in my enterprises coming off, and to make it look beautiful. Why not? It's not that much more difficult to plan waterways, plantings, and that to make it look pretty as well. And it definitely makes you feel much better, even in a drought, to go around the farm and have water there when nobody else does, to have plants surviving when it's getting bleak and dry and windy. And even after fires, I had plants coming back within a few short weeks with no rain.
And you've mentioned biodiversity a few times. What is biodiversity and what do you implement on your land for biodiversity?
When I was a chemical farmer, we used to kill everything and plant 3 grasses and 2 clovers. We had a biodiversity of 5 plants. If the season wasn't perfect for those 5 plants, you ended up with nothing. And now I've got 80 different plants growing on in my pastures that I know of. Even in my waterways, they used to be muddy evaporation dishes. We've now counted 8 or 9 different water plants in there. So that's the biodiversity, biologically diverse plants in the system. So if I'm improving a pasture now, if say I bought some new country and it's a bit of a monoculture or there's some weeds in there, I might chew it down quick. No, actually what I do is I throw seed out first onto the dead grass or dry grass and then chew it down. So then you've got seed-soil contact and then hope it rains the next day and I'll get biodiversity coming up. So we'll throw out 20 different species of seeds and you'll get things coming up. What Christine Jones and Elaine Ingham and Nicole Masters have taught me is under the soil, all those different forms of roots are putting fertility down in there. I did learn at university that plants leaked 30% of what they made into the soil. We were taught that they leaked it as though they didn't know how to hold the nutrients in their root system over the millions of years they've been developing. And it just leaked out. Now we know they gave or give to the soil to feed the microbes to bring in nutrients that they need. And that's promoting more and more biodiversity under the soil, that we've got billions of little critters in there doing everything for us. We've now got nitrogen-fixing bacteria, free-living phosphorus-fixing bacteria in the soil. We don't need to add phosphorus, nitrogen and all these artificial fertilisers. It's there.
And you keep talking about hope and goals. What is your wellness spring? What is your wellness go-to?
My wellness go-to, eating healthy foods and being involved in growing healthy things is what makes my soul sing. Being around people that are positive and excited about all this just is a great joy. I see my role in life in meeting these people and converting, because a lot of them are either just scientists that in the past have not had access to land, and so getting their information and making it into a working model that works for me, and so people can come to Jillamatong and see that, yep, natural sequence farming works. Biological inputs, stimulants and things like that work. and holistic management and grazing management works. And so that's part of the thing. And it's consequently, groups like Source for Life, I've let them come in and look at my books, and they've done the accounting, the forensic accounting of, is it economic? And there's a 54-page report in the Source for Life website on Jillamatong. I've done benchmarking groups with other accounting firms, and it pays. Apart from it looking good and feeling good, you make more money. Why wouldn't you want to do it?
Exactly. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much for giving up your precious time.
My pleasure.